afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our virtual workshop. Happy to see so many folks on the line again, and if this is your fourth consecutive webinar, thank you for joining us the whole time. If this is the first webinar that you're joining from within our virtual workshop, you're in for a treat, and we will be able to point you to some more resources at the conclusion of this webinar as well. So in our last webinar of this virtual workshop, we're going to be discussing sector support for implementing sustainable infrastructure. This final webinar of this workshop will carry through our themes of actionable steps toward implementing sustainable infrastructure. The strategies outlined in this webinar can be used on every project and by every project team. ENVISION users and advocates from both the private, public, and academic sectors will describe the value of ENVISION in team training and professional education. Speakers will show how education directly translates to project success. Then we'll also be taking a project-centered view for accounting for the economy of sustainable infrastructure. We'll identify the full spectrum of benefits to make better decisions based on the full life cycle of a project. With that, I'd like to introduce myself as your moderator for today. My name is Lindsay Geiger. I am the Director of Education for the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. I am very excited to bring this lineup of speakers to you today. These are our most experienced ENVISION users, sustainability experts from across the industry. They've got a wealth of information to share with you today, practical knowledge, things that you can be applying to your projects and using with your project teams starting tomorrow. So I think you'll be really excited to see what we have lined up for you, and I won't delay any further. And I'd like to introduce our first panel of experts. Kicking us off, we'll hear from Michael Bloom. Michael provides sustainability consulting services. Since 1991, he has helped restore environmentally impacted sites, plan and design resilient public infrastructure facilities, and has helped communities looking to realize enhanced economic, social, and environmental project outcomes. He became an ENVISION Sustainability Professional, or ENVSP, in 2013, has been an ENVISION verifier since 2014, and has been an ISI qualified ENVISION trainer since 2019. In that same year, in 2019, Michael, along with Liz Parent of 5 Engineering, provided ENVSP credentialing training to 124 professionals in the Harris County region, Houston region of Texas. This was after Harris County officials decided to move forward with the use of ENVISION. He'll be sharing more of his experiences with us today. Michael is a certified floodplain manager, a board-certified environmental engineer, and a professional engineer in Texas and 7 other states. Next, we'll be hearing from Judith Rodriguez and Christina Contreras, both from the Zofna's Program for Sustainable Infrastructure at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Judith is a researcher and designer with experience in sustainable infrastructure, urban design, and landscape architecture. At the Zofna's program, she worked on urban water infrastructure, mapping vulnerability to climate change, and flood resilience best practices in cities. She's an advocate for climate action and the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. She's participated in the UN Solution Summit and in SDG learning focus sessions during the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. Judith holds dual master's degrees in landscape architecture and urban design from Harvard University GSD, and a master in architecture from the Illinois Institute of Technology. She's also an ENVSP, a lead AP, and a municipal vulnerability preparedness provider. Her co-presenter is Christina Contreras. Christina is a research associate in the Zofna's Program for Sustainable Infrastructure at the Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Here she focuses on creating and applying sustainability indicators for infrastructure projects. During the last years, Christina has worked in close collaboration with academia, the private sector, and multilateral financial institutions to identify and reward the best practices in infrastructure sustainability in the US and globally. Her main areas of interest include sustainable development in the urban context, sustainable infrastructure policy, and its alignment with country-specific long-term vision. Rounding out this hour's panel of experts is Julie Kaler. Julie works for the City of Westminster in the Public Works and Utilities Department of the as the Utilities Engineering Manager. She has more than 18 years of experience in the water and wastewater industry with a focus on planning, design, construction, and operations of utility infrastructure. Before joining the city, Julie worked as a consulting engineer for municipalities in the Front Range of Colorado. She served as project manager for design and construction of municipal water and wastewater projects ranging in size from $10,000 to over $20 million. She holds a Master's of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Colorado and a Master of Science degree in Development Management from the American University in Washington, D.C. She's a registered professional engineer in Colorado and an ENVISION sustainability professional. See, I told you all we had the best and brightest lined up for you this first hour. So, Michael, why don't you get us started here this morning? And please, when you are ready, welcome, and you may get started with your presentation.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks to everyone that's hopped on the call or the webinar today. I wanted to just highlight kind of what I'm going to be covering in my section of the hour. I just want to focus on kind of how the Houston region went from sort of not really paying attention to ENVISION to really embracing it and moving forward, and just kind of tell that story of the folks that were in the trenches trying to encourage folks to look at it in more than they were before. And so the topics today will be just a little bit of overview about Houston and Harris County for folks that might not be familiar with our area, kind of the timeline of all the work that folks were doing to try to get people to pay attention, and kind of how the tools that were used for that, and then sort of what's happened really, especially mostly in 2019, but on into 2020 as well. So for folks that aren't familiar with it, you know, Harris County is one of the coastal counties of Texas, about 1,800 square miles. Houston sits in the middle of it, and we kind of butt up against Galveston Bay, but we really aren't, you know, actually adjacent to the Gulf of Mexico, really. It's another 20 or 30 miles out to Galveston. And then when you look at the county itself, right, this is a kind of a zoom up of those 1,800 square miles. A lot of it is actually the city of Houston. About a third of it is the city of Houston. About 670 or so of those square miles is incorporated city. But there's a bunch of other smaller cities around as well. But the county itself does have control over a bunch of part of those 1,800 square miles that are, you know, not incorporated. They're not cities at all. They're just the only form of government out there is the county. This is an aerial view showing kind of the development footprint with a 60-mile scale shown on there to give you a sense of how big this area is. And then just so for folks that are from the Northeast or from the Boston area, originally I thought we'd be sitting in Cambridge right now, but we'll just bear with me on the comparison here. But so if you just plop this same 60-mile ruler into the Boston area to just give you scale, this is the Boston area with that same 60-mile scale. So you could fit a lot of Bostons inside the urban footprint of the Houston metro with room to spare, is basically my point. So what happened in the Harris County area, and really I would say that the city of Houston is really not who I'm talking about. The Harris County government is the government that's kind of taken the lead and has responded to this advocacy work. The city of Houston's kind of slowly coming along, but they're a little bit slower in their process for a lot of reasons. But really, this is the story is about Harris County. So I just wanted to highlight that for folks that might not be familiar. So obviously in 2012, ENVISION was published. There were a bunch of folks in the Houston Harris County area that were, again, you know, working to try to promote ENVISION, including actually one of the former governors, or, you know, board of directors of ENVISION, of ISI, I should say, Wayne Klotz, who some of the folks on the call may know. But at one point, you know, there was some opportunities to present ENVISION in different settings. Rice University had a conference more about stormwater. And then there were some other advocacy, or I would call them really chambers of commerce. West Houston Association and North Houston Association are really chambers of commerce that advocate for investment and for quality growth and economic activity. And then Houston Wilderness is more of a conservation group, right? And so those three organizations adopted formal resolutions of support. And then in 2016, there was I was actually invited to co I guess co-teach or teach a module at a class at Rice University on sustainable design, and we had the students, the graduate students and undergrad, look at the storm surge protection for hurricanes and storm surge activity. These are different protection ideas that were talked about, and we had them evaluate three different ideas using ENVISION, which was a pretty monumental undertaking for the graduate students, but it was good to have them dig in. And then in 2016, there were a lot of opportunities to talk about ENVISION in different educational events or networking events. So the West Houston Association actually still has excuse me, a sustainability committee, and that committee would host periodically a little, breakfast or lunch event about different topics, and one of them was about the Tarrant Regional Water District getting an ENVISION verified project done up in their part of Texas, that's around the Dallas area. And then there was another opportunity where folks were more behind the scenes with the contracting community and the engineering community, talking about this large water purification plant expansion, maybe possibly having that seek verification. That actually didn't pan out, but we felt like we were pretty close to having a group of project sponsors look at it from that perspective. And then, kind of significant change in terms of the local governance here. Back in November of 18, right, we had the midterm elections, and that resulted in a change in the elected body of the county. In Texas, counties are governed by what's known as a commissioner's court. They're kind of like the board of directors, if you will, elected board or board of governors. And the presiding officer of that commissioner's court is called a judge, even though they don't try cases. So Judge Lena Hidalgo in this picture was elected. This was in December, where we met as part of the ASCE Government Affairs Committee, these two new elected officials. And so that we talked to them about ENVISION and about resiliency and flood mitigation. This is all kind of after the Harvey hurricane that everyone heard about in the national media, and so they were interested in what we had to say, and ASCE was a resource for them. But in particular, Commissioner Garcia, who again is one of the elected officials who kind of governs 1/4 of the county, he was particularly interested in ENVISION and really kind of ran with it. And we'll talk more a little bit about that later. But so some of the tools that we used in terms of talking to folks about it, we'll highlight here, and I'll go into a little bit more detail. Everyone on the call is familiar with triple bottom line, but getting other entities to help you is also part of it. And I would say that for the public sector, especially in this part of the world, Texas in particular, there's a lot of focus on kind of the business case. What's the return on investment, both from a public infrastructure perspective, use of taxpayer dollars, and leveraging that, and then also even certainly for the private sector as well. But so really just talking about the fact that if you can maximize that total value or total return using the triple bottom line approach, and that's really a better bang for your public dollar. That I think rings more true or has a higher level of success than kind of some environmental perspectives or social perspectives, depending again on who you're talking to. It really does depend on who you're talking to. So we really use that a lot. And then we also tried to get other people, other groups, other entities to sort of embrace that. And that's kind of where the resolutions of support came from. So this is actually the text of the resolution of support that the West Houston Association adopted. And if anybody is interested, you can contact Lindsay or me, and I'd be happy to share with you the Word file, the MS Word file for this. But it basically has a series of kind of statements related to population growth and the investment in infrastructure needs and how those infrastructure investments can be sort of single purpose versus the triple bottom line approach. And then it talks about the various third party tools that are out there, LEAD included, and ENVISION, of course. And then it basically just says, we resolve that folks should look at it. And it wasn't even a mandate. It's just basically saying, hey, take a look at this if you haven't heard about it. It's pretty cool. And then, so that was back in 2014. And so to get that kind of recognition, and then of course the organization board and all the people who were involved in passing that resolution, become sort of indirectly they become advocates, and then people will ask them about it. Hey, I saw that resolution y'all did. What's that about? And of course the leadership of these organizations have a nice network, right, of people that are in decision makers and thought leaders in the community. So that helps as well. And so these are the different entities that you can kind of go to in almost every part of North America. There's a chapter or a branch or a section of these various entities. Some of these, are more active than others, right, depending on where you are. But they all can help carry the water, in the conversation. And so then, excuse me, the results really kind of all after, slogging along since 2013 or 2014, the folks that had been, felt like we were pushing a rope up a hill. These new officials were sworn in on January 1st of 19. And then really the first time this elected body met, which was, 7 days later, they approved a request for credentialing by the Harris County engineer. So this gentleman here, I don't know if y'all can see the mouse moving, but he's the third one from the right. His name is John Blunt. He's the county engineer for Harris County. He, put that item on the agenda, and it was unanimously approved. And so then we kind of it became a situation of sort of trying to push the rope to suddenly having to run after the rope as it was being pulled ahead of us very quickly. So, then later in January, the county engineer, John, announced to the engineering profession that y'all have to start reporting to us how many ENVSPs you have, and we're going to use that as part of our selection process. And, y'all need to get credentialed, basically, is what he said. Then in March, one of the other trainers, Liz Parent, with 5 Engineering here in striped, horizontal striped shirt, she did an introductory thing up in, this is actually in Houston, but it's University of Texas, Tyler, but in the Houston branch. So it was a Houston kind of college educational opportunity. And then in April, there was suddenly the engineering community was like, hey, what's this? What are you talking about? We need more info. And so the county engineer and the senior environmental manager, Nick Russo, and Natalie Warehousen from RPS, and Todd Buckingham from Friesen Nichols, and I did a big 2-hour kind of intro for everybody. And that was very well attended, over 150 people, just to try to get everybody up to speed on what it was and what credentialing meant. And that, again, continued the conversation. Then in May, John Blunt, the county engineer, had a lot of his senior staff at the downtown engineering office, plus precinct, one of the four sort of the four entities that make up the county. They're called precincts. So 1/4 of the county had some leadership managers in this class as well. And then a couple of days later, West Houston hosted a class. This was a little cramped space, but we kind of had to make do. We set up a little kids table in the back there for a few of the participants that couldn't fit around this main table. And so that we were on a roll doing some credentialing here. Then in May, end of May, we did more credentialing. This one was almost 40 people. I think we had 1 or 2 seats missing for something that happened to come up that day for them. Again, this is Liz Perrin and I kind of co-teaching these. It's pretty hard to do 8 hours by yourself. And for those of you out there who are trainers, it's definitely better to tag team it. And then in September of 19, this Commissioner Garcia, who I mentioned earlier, he announced, and the commissioners approved the design contract with a team to design the first roadway improvement project that was going to be pursued in ENVISION verification. So that was pretty exciting. And so we're still working on that right now. Our whole public engagement process is going to be having to be rejiggered and readjusted in light of the COVID-19 stuff, but we're working through that. And then back again, more educational activities with some of our partners in the other professional societies, of course. Then in November, we did yet another class for 39 people. I think one person had to bail at the last second. And so that was kind of what's happened in 2019. What I think Lindsay alluded to it in the intro, over 120 people trained, and really exciting interest in not only the professional groups, the private sector, but then the government, Harris County running with it. And that roadway project is fun because pretty much all of the county decision makers, from the local precinct as well as the downtown engineering support group, they all were trained and credentialed as ENVSPs. And so when we had one of our earlier meetings, we said, well, who's going to be the official ENVSP on this project and get it registered and do the submittals? And they all looked at me, you're the guy, not us. And I was like, well, you guys can. You're all trained up. You can do it. But anyway, so that's the way that's going. And then we've got a couple of other projects that are sort of still, being thought about as potential verified projects. But it's been an exciting ride. And I guess with that, I don't know, Lindsay, I'll stop sharing and give it back to you to do the transition. I don't know if we're doing Q&A.
Great, thank you. Yes, Michael, we'll hold our Q&A until our other panelists have had an opportunity to present their information, and then we will open it up for Q&A for the remainder of the first hour. So with that, we will travel from Texas to Latin America, and Judith and Christina will share their experiences conducting ENVISION training in Latin America, as well as a sustainable infrastructure focused course. So the floor is yours, Christina. Christina, you are also still on mute, so don't forget to unmute before you start. Yep. And if you want to full screen your slides for us, please.
I think that is also nice to see the people. So So thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. And thank you, Lindsay, and all the ISI team for the invitation to share with you a couple of initiatives that we have been working on. So this presentation is called How to Use ENVISION for Training Purposes. So we would like to share with you today two different initiatives that we at the Softness program have been working on for the last month. The first one is a class, sorry. The first one is a course that is happening at Harvard University at the School of Continuing Education. This class is called Sustainable Infrastructure Learning from Practice. And the second initiative that we would like to share with you is ENVISION Professional Certification that we conducted last year in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. So first, let's start with the class. So why do we think that it's important to have a class regarding sustainable infrastructure? When we put this class together, we thought that there are so many different challenges that need to be addressed. So many of these you might be familiar with. For example, there is a need to speak the same language. We know that sustainability is a cross-disciplinary field, and as such, there are people coming from different backgrounds. That creates some complication when it comes to communication. Also, there is a lot of information, and there is more and more information that has been created during the last years, and that is making a little bit difficult to navigate. That information is, in most cases, fragmented. So for people that are new to this field, it's difficult to understand or even to try to identify what's the information that is worth spending some time to look into it and maybe which one is not. We know that we had had a decade, I would say, of diagnostics. We know what are the gaps currently in sustainable infrastructure. We know how to improve that. We know that very well at the Softness program because we have been working on this for more than a decade. We also know that it's extremely important to start focusing on the implementation, which at the moment, I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing. Many people talk now about how sustainable infrastructure can help us understand sustainable development or the sustainable development goals. Still, this connection is not fully understood. Also, many of you or all of us in this call, probably we are familiar with the ENVISION rating systems and other tools that exist worldwide to quantify sustainable infrastructure. Still, we need to be able to scale up the implementation of these tools. And last but not least, I think that is extremely important, not just for the conversation that we are having on the class, but also conversation like today, any other like comments or meet that you all have like probably daily. It's important to strengthen a sense of urgency. I don't think that it's okay to keep talking about sustainability in infrastructure as something nice to have, but we need to be able to all of us translate that urgency. And why we decided to put this class together. So for the last 10 years, we have been working at the Softness program on the development of many different case studies. At the moment, we have more than 40 around the world, equally more than $20 billion investment already assessed. This is in more than 12 countries. So we thought that we need to be able to spread that knowledge outside our circle and outside our groups that we interact on a daily basis. So we decided that an online class was probably one of the best ways to go because it allows us to connect with people in every corner of the world. So for the people that are interested in learning about sustainable infrastructure, what is this course focused on? What would you learn through this class? As I say, not a clear voice. Talk about what is a sustainable infrastructure project, even though we are now getting to converge to that common understanding. Obviously, we rely heavily in ENVISION rating system criteria that the ENVISION rating system has developed, but we also bring to this class the conversation that is happening at different, in this case, like a picture of the framework from Sustainable Infrastructure from Inter-American Development Bank, but also other groups that are now talking about the same issue. As it cannot be otherwise, we make a strong emphasis in what are tools that currently exist. Probably many of you are familiar with the Planning Sustainable Cities. It's a work and a book that it was launched at the Softness program a couple of years ago, which we have the opportunity to look at different projects or different infrastructure types, not just at those 7 infrastructure types, but the synergies between them, as well as the ENVISION rating system. And as I said, for us, it's really important to bring all the conversations that are happening to the class, because there are people that are interested in having understanding. There are many of our students that they are interested in going into public policy. I think is their program. So in this case, a picture from the high-level political forum, United Nations last year, in which Judith Rodriguez and I have the opportunity to moderate, participate in a panel talking about quality education, climate action, and infrastructure. As I mentioned before, many people will say like sustainable infrastructure is a key driver to achieve the 2030 agenda, but still those are not very well understood. So we make a strong emphasis in getting to understand how and to what end those interactions and overlaps exist. During the last couple of days, we have been talking a lot about finance, because finance at the end of the day is a core element of how we ensure that infrastructure projects move forward. As such, we also look at what is happening on the financial world and what is happening in the development world. In this case, this is a picture that I took a couple of years ago, the Global Infrastructure Forum that is in Washington, D.C. And there you see, and there you see the presidents and the heads of all the development banks in the world, sending a very clear and very strong message that finance is important and willing to identify how they can mobilize money at scale. That is what we need for this large project. This is also enforced, or this is reinforced, I would say, having the moderation of this panel by the Deputy General of the United Nations, as you see on the left side. As you can identify from the name of the class, that is called Sustainable Infrastructure Learning from Practice, we believe that that last part, learning from practice, is critical. And as such, we are using many of the case studies and many of the lessons learned that we have identified through our research for the last year to bring this to the students so they can learn in a very practical manner of how to make a project more sustainable. And lastly, probably you all have experienced this before when it comes to sustainability communication. Sometimes it's an issue. So we would like to create that common channel of communication in which people from different expertise can start converging in what they understand about infrastructure. This is my last slide. All of this comes together in 4 different modules, looking about quantification of sustainable infrastructure, how sustainable infrastructure can help us achieve basic services, environmental sustainability, and a strong strategy towards achieving inclusive growth and development. And with that, I will pass it to Judith, that is gonna keep talking about the class. Okay.
All right, I'm ready to share. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you, Cristina. And so now that you know what the course is about, now I'm gonna talk to you about who is part of the class, who's interested, and the how we do it. So we are very lucky. We have a global classroom and we have not been disturbed because the class is completely online. So it's ongoing, and we have students from Canada, Spain, New Zealand, Singapore, Brazil, the US, from all parts, from Massachusetts, California, Washington, and also from the UK. When we ask the students, what is your profile? What is your experience? So we have more than half of the students that are pursuing a master in sustainability at Harvard Division for Continuing Education. And then we also have students pursuing a bachelor's, and we have students who are not in a degree program but are interested in the topic, as they might do a program later or a certificate.
Hey, Judith,
Yes.
could you pick up your screen share? It didn't take the first time.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, let me, is this working?
That looks good, thank you.
Right, so maybe I'll just go back to show you the map. These
That's a good map.
students are from. And this is the profile of the students. Many of them also have experience. So we have students with more than 10 years of experience in infrastructure, and these in energy, wastewater, water, and also policy. And then we have a group of students who don't have experience or are using this course as an introduction. We also asked the students, so what are your learning goals? Like, why are you here? And they had a lot of answers, and many of them also connect with our goals in teaching this course. So many want to feel connected with a deeper cause. Many want to better understand the SDGs, to learn more about smart cities. They want to learn about tools to quantify sustainable infrastructure. They want to learn about sustainable infrastructure implementation. So we devise what we call the core teaching elements. So these are 5 core elements where every class it's framed this way. So we start with a global overview. Then we talk about what are the challenges for sustainable infrastructure types. Then we talk about what are the global commitments and targets that we need to meet for that type or issues associated with an infrastructure type. And then we talked about what are the applicable sustainable infrastructure frameworks and tools. And these, of course, we talk about ENVISION and the Planning Sustainable Cities guidelines that Christina explained before. And then we go in depth into the project level. So we take a deeper view at this. And then we have these other floating elements, which are based on the student work and discussion of the class. So these go across this course. So for example, we have class discussion that goes through many of the course. And what we want to do with this is have a feedback loop and a way for the students and a structure for the students to navigate all the sustainable infrastructure conversations and have a clear view of how they can contribute to more implementation of sustainable infrastructure. I'm going to talk a bit more about each of the elements as well. And we also, of course, integrate our professional experience into the course. So these are some of the events we have assisted. Of course, the Softness Program Workshop are a big part of it, as is today. And we are connecting the dots. We are bringing the ideas that are being talked about in these spaces to the classroom. And how do we integrate ENVISION? Well, ENVISION is a big element, it's a core element of the class. As Christina explained before, so these are some the tools that we mainly talk in the class. And we also integrate different courses. For example, this is one of the floating elements. This is infrastructure and me survey. So it's a way to have the students be aware of their infrastructure networks in their locality. And how this works is that we ask them a few questions. So for example, this was about food infrastructure. So do you consume in a month of the food you purchase? This is actually very important now as we are in the COVID-19 times. You can see some of the answers, and 64% of the class produces almost no food waste. Let's see. And the way of catalyzing everything into, or synthesize all the core, all the knowledge or the discussions in the class is through a final project where ENVISION is a big part. So we assess a project, infrastructure project of many types, and use ENVISION to it. And we also do an SDG scan to also see how the project contributes to the achievement of the SDGs, or which areas also are not being considered by the SDGs. And this for us is a way of building a platform, and in the hopes that when we teach this module again, we can even like learn more from projects and have students also have these final projects as a way of showing their portfolio in sustainable infrastructure. And we also have SDG podcast. So every student has to produce a podcast based on one of the SDGs, and they have to explain the SDG targets, how the SDG is related to infrastructure, provide examples of projects that are innovative, ways that they think a project could meet the SDGs. And these are some screenshots of some of the podcasts I have been submitting. And this is very exciting, as we allow them to be as creative as they want. And the podcasts also help us to generate discussions. So every student has to comment on their peers' podcast. And then we see like some of the discussions now are referring to previous discussion posts from the SDGs that was presented in week 3rd, etc. And if you are interested in knowing more about the course, in knowing if you could join us for the next time we provide it, please contact us. This is the website at the Harvard Division for Continuing Education. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a bit of the ENVISION trainings we have done internationally. So at the Softness program, we have translated the ENVISION manual into Spanish and Portuguese. So this has opened a lot of doors for us, as we can reach out to many teams who might not be as familiar with English or the concepts that are brought in ENVISION. And this is one of the trainings that we did in Brazil last year. It was a 2-day workshop. And the team is working with what could be the first ENVISION certification in Brazil. And there are many projects that are being designed as we speak in Latin America. We see a lot of potential in this, and also other countries. And we hope more trainings are to come after the COVID-19 crisis disappears. And thank you so much. And please reach to us if you have any questions or you're interested in knowing more about the course. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. I think you will be getting some folks contacting you. I'm seeing some questions on, whether folks can get the list of the podcast. So I'm sure you will have garnered some interest. We will move on to Q&A after our next panelist presents. I did want to give the floor to Julie Kaler, who will be continuing on our theme of education and showing us how in the city of Westminster they've been able to use ENVSP training as a way to create a common language for sustainability. Julie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lindsay. Let's see, am I sharing?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm coming to you live from Westminster, Colorado. We're an urban center outside of Denver. And in the city, we've been using ENVISION over the past 5.5 to 6 years. And I want to talk with you today about how it's impacted the way we do work. And I'll provide some examples to demonstrate that I think ENVISION has taken hold in the city. A little background. Westminster, we call ourselves the next urban center of the Colorado Front Range. And scroll all the way down. It embraces the outdoors and is one of the most sustainable cities in America. Well, as an engineer, I want to know, by what criteria do we say that we are one of the most sustainable cities? And using my ENVISION training, I've been able to talk with others about the importance of having a metric. So here's a brief history of ENVISION in Westminster. Since 2015, we've trained 41 people, 34 are still staff trained from all departments in the city. First, we focused on public works, where I work, and then we expanded to department heads for wider support. So Department of Parks, Rec, and Libraries, Department Head of Planning and Development. And then we went back to citywide self-selected, where we had participants from parks, economic development, streets. We've really branched out. In public works, we made a specific decision and selected 2 capital improvements projects to pursue the ENVISION verification. On the wastewater side, we have a biosolids project, which is 90% constructed. And this has to do with biosolids dewatering to reduce the amount of water. It reduces tanker truck traffic and improves the product that we deliver to the city's farm as well as contract farms. The second project is a new water treatment facility. We are at the pilot and process selection phase, so super early on, but we've already not only made a decision to pursue ENVISION, but we've started talking about it, and I have some slides later where I'll provide some details. And in 2017, the city hired our very first chief sustainability officer, and he feels like his job is to rally city sustainability projects, and he helps us create a long-term sustainability agenda for the city to enhance our city's vision and goal. I think of ENVISION in terms of this circle of control and influence, and how ENVISION has caught on. I think of public works as the instigator. That's our control. And by control, I mean we trained a lot of public works staff, probably 15 or so. And then as we start talking about ENVISION and our chief sustainability officer gets in on the conversation, we start having this common language where project managers across the city can talk about sustainability. So we expand our control into influence, and influence goes out into areas of concern. So here's my first example, Water 2025, which is our new water treatment facility. Public Works is instigating this effort. We made a specific decision to pursue ENVISION verification, and we are expanding on our education into areas of influence outside of the immediate project team. So our new water treatment facility, it's actually replacing an aged existing water treatment facility. And we want to responsibly plan for the end of life for our oldest water treatment facility, which is 50 years old now. And when Water 2025 is completely constructed, we will retire our existing water treatment facility in around 2040. ENVISION verification. Part of what we're doing right now, as in the piloting and the process selection, as a separate component, we've gone out to the community where we have about 34 self-identified design working group members. These are community people who take an interest in helping us shape certain aspects of what the water treatment facility will look like, smell like, doesn't smell bad, it's a good one, the lighting and landscaping. So this is a really important step, not only for gaining points in ENVISION, but we use the ENVISION, the checklist and the themes as we develop our agendas with the design working group. And we talk to them about identifying the right project and doing the right project right. And it's just a way to expand the ENVISION training out to regular people in our community. Not only our design working group, we are partnering right now with a local university, CU Boulder, and we have a grad student helping us on our pilot facility. Grad student comes with PhD support. Well, one of these professors has a senior level design class where university students put together a proposal, and we simulated hiring them to help the city in kind of an educational format. But one of the criteria in our request for proposal was ENVISION certification. So the students suddenly became like, what is this ENVISION thing? So we've used what we know about ENVISION, carried it out into this group of university students who now, I don't really think they went out and got qualified to be ENVSPs, but they've looked at the website, they've looked at the checklist, and I could see in the proposal coming back to us that they took it to heart because they identified one of their 4 team members as their own sustainability officer representing sustainability on their proposal and then their project moving forward. My next example is a series of interviews that the Chief Sustainability Officer and I conducted. We explored how ENVISION could be used throughout the city with other project managers as they implemented their capital improvements projects, and I'll abbreviate to call them CIPs. We wanted to know, how does the rating tool and framework mesh with what we're now implementing? So we conducted these in 2018. We did about 16 one-hour discussions with 12 different project managers, and at the time, 5 of them were already trained ENVSPs. We used the ENVISION checklist, and we reviewed and identified credits that could relate to the CIP project that was under discussion. We included CIPs in the stormwater area, streetscapes, public works projects. What we found was many CIPs were already aligned with some level of ENVISION credits. Staff seemed knowledgeable about ENVISION, even if they weren't familiar with the ENVISION framework itself. Generally, we found more alignment with leadership, resource allocation, and natural world. And sometimes we had a hard time with quality of life and particularly climate. And then the feedback from the PMs that we interviewed, it either helped them confirm the direction they were already on or provided them with new ideas to consider as they pursued their project. And ultimately, our takeaways were, I'm going to repeat myself here a little, sorry. Many of the capital improvement projects were already aligned with ENVISION credits. Staff seemed knowledgeable about the framework themes, even if they didn't know about the whole framework itself. They were really interested in having more ENVISION training, and a lot of those interviewees became the students in our latest and greatest ENVISION training course. And as stewards of public funds, staff talked about being mindful of the need to balance between applying tools like ENVISION or LEAD or other tools that are out there with the impact to a project budget, the timeline, and staff time. Some projects we determined were not a really good fit. For example, when there's a like-for-like replacement, we had a bunch of stormwater inlets, the cast iron grates and so on that were damaged and needed replacement. A new stormwater inlet for a damaged one, not a great ENVISION tool. But then some projects considered a third-party verification, but then the cost was determined to be too high. And again, expressed caution around using taxpayer and revenue money for buying points. And I'm using buying in quotes. This came up particularly on the wastewater project that I mentioned. And that project carefully considered the degree to which the building would incorporate certain types of building materials. The decision was taken to use a typical building material like split face block to keep the budget within expected norms instead of possibly increasing the budget to pursue different materials, particularly in the roofing, that would have earned more ENVISION points, but would have been a cost to the project. And this project is on track for a bronze verification. And when it comes through, and I expect it to come through in 2020, that will be the very first third-party verification in the city of Westminster, and we are pretty proud of that. So as a citywide approach, we're considering providing all the project managers with a copy of the checklist to use as the framework to guide their discussions, and then PMs will have the flexibility to incorporate the principles as appropriate. We are committed to train and certifying any PM who wants to be trained. The challenge is finding funds, but I'm sure we can figure that part out. And then working with the Chief Sustainability Officer, we want to look at case by case, identifying what he calls key CIP projects that must be self-verified by the city to the ENVISION framework criteria. We are considering different criteria for the key word, such as the cost of the project or the potential for high community or environmental impact, visibility to the community, or as a showcase project for the city. And then on a case-by-case basis, identify extremely important projects that we will commit to having third-party verified. And then again, we will develop the criteria to define extremely important and what that means. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the role of the city's Chief Sustainability Officer as he uses his influence to expand outside of his department, which is the city manager's office, and into
Yeah, can you hear me?
is
All right, cool.
which is other department heads and even into city councilors. And his goal is to embed ENVISION in the CIP as well as other city processes. He has shared that
Collins?
his primary goal is to make friends with the budget director as well as the public works
The hell, about New York?
and use the budget and the CIP as a lever to embed ENVISION. Talking to the budget director early and often in the CIP process, and trying to get buy-in from the project managers who are the worker bees, as well as department heads and leaders in the city. His goal is to show tangible value to the leadership, how the ENVISION framework supports the city's strategic goals and provides cost savings, return on investment, cost avoidance, and how it benefits residents. We're also convinced that marketing works. We talk about ENVISION. We talk about it on our internal website as well as external. Communications are critical to keep everyone up to speed on how important sustainability is. And then by 2021, he's working to create an official ENVISION policy for the city's CIP process, which is supported by the city manager. Almost getting to my conclusion, I challenged myself, how do I know that education and training are expanding control and influencing people within the city's structure, as well as our residents and community? ENVISION education leads to elevated and informed discussions. Newly trained staff, every time I pass them in the hallway or on the sidewalk, I learn about a new effort where they are applying ENVISION verification, and in particular, they've identified a stormwater project where they want to seek third-party verification. And then there's this other fellow, John, like, Julie, and I'm echoing what Michael said earlier, Julie, you should really take ENVISION on this project I'm working on. And I said, just what Michael said, like, John, you are fully trained. You can do this too. Kind of a funny conversation, but I'm flattered that he asked. Using city division managers, this is a training I was recently at. We were asked to, and that's my sticky note poster, talk about or sticky note topics of sustainability. And we quickly identified relevant issues related to sustainability. Nobody was there saying, well, first we need to define it and have a big discussion about that. People went right to different aspects of sustainability. It was quite impressive, and that's why I took that photo. So our trained staff have taken ENVISION outside the city, as I talked about with our Water 2025 project. Right now, we are gearing up for the 21 and 22 budget cycle within the city. The Policy and Budget Office came to the Chief Sustainability Officer saying, hey, we'd like to include this guidance in the budget request. Can you take a look at it and wordsmith it so we get it right? We were so flattered that we were asked, and it had to do with moving in the direction of policy guidance to people requesting to spend city money for the 21-22 cycle. So I'm just going to sum by saying that I conclude that not only Public Works, but other staff are in control of ENVISION and sustainability talk. And we are expanding our influence on a variety of levels and places, and almost without even thinking of it. It's a language we all speak, and more we all understand. Thank you all for listening, and I will take questions as part of the group when Lindsay's ready to queue them up.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. And yes, I think it would be important for us to take a moment or two for questions before we pivot to our next group of presenters. So I would like to take that moment to do that for you all now. And then for folks on the line, I think we can plan to extend our conversation today by about 15 or 20 minutes. So we'll look to wrap up toward maybe 15, 20 minutes after the 4 o'clock hour. Hang on, I can't talk and Zoom at the same time, folks. Not. Alrighty. So again, I wanted to take a moment to ask our panelists for some additional information before we pivot to our next group of speakers. So my first question is for Michael and Julie. At the beginning of this webinar, I did make the promise to our group that they will have tangible things, advice, things that they can use on the job tomorrow. So I'm hoping that you'll be helping me make good on that promise. And my question for you both, if you're able to both take a moment to answer it, is from your experiences, what advice do you have or what recommendations can you make for other municipalities or advocates that are looking to do the same thing, looking to spark and spark and inspire sustainability within their organizations? So Julie, just having wrapped up your presentation kind of on these concluding marks, do you want to take a pass at that first for us, please?
Sure, thanks, Lindsay. I think my best advice is to start asking questions of people who seem to be speaking the ENVISION language. I knew I was a trained ENVSP when I came to the city, and I learned that the Public Works Director was also trained. So he and I just started talking. And then as I met more and more people in the city, I found out that one of my colleagues in the facilities group who takes care of all the buildings was a huge sustainability advocate, and he was charged with increasing city sustainability. And so from one conversation, it became two, and then two became three, and then Public Works was able to fund a training. And my advice is ask questions, call people up, ask them what they're doing. And that might lead to more opportunities and more trainings.
Great, thank you. So focus on finding people and asking the right questions. I think that's great. Michael, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that it's definitely a multiple pronged approach, and there's not like a silver bullet, but I would definitely encourage folks, and I think a lot of the engineering and professional groups, planners and architects, a lot of those organizations encourage folks to get more involved in the politics of things, the politics of public infrastructure and local governments. And I would say, being more involved in that aspect of things would, does open doors and does allow you to talk to, the elected leaders of the area that you may be interested in, and then having, being a technical or sort of a sustainability resource, and bringing up the tools and the approaches that are out there, like Envision, can go, if the elected official, is supportive of that and thinks there's a value in kind of adjusting the way public dollars are spent using that approach, then it can go a long way. So I would say the political side of things would be a great tool or opportunity.
Great, thank you for that. And Judith and Christina, I have a similar question for you, but somewhat of a different approach here. Given that you're working with communities that might be newer to Envision, whether it's through the trainings that you've completed in Latin America or through the coursework that you're working on, what do you project is the trajectory of these communities that you're working with in their approach to achieving sustainability, in their approach to achieving and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals?
Say that in most cases, the first reaction is like people are scared because they think that it's going to be something very complicated and that maybe the projects are not apt to having an international system coming and being implemented in their more like local or regional context. On the other side, like the advice that we always give to them is like, well, this is gonna be a great way to understand how far you are. Because in many cases, when you start looking at what are the things that you are already doing, in some cases, people get surprised. Because like, oh, I didn't know this, something that we have been doing for years that can be like can count towards achieving certain points. So I think that in most cases is to create that baseline that, as you mentioned, it doesn't exist in other regions, but public policy in some areas is quite advanced. For example, we go to Brazil, when it comes to environmental regulations, the environmental regulations in Brazil are quite strict. So in some cases they get surprised, say that it's more about creating the system that is going to allow them in a systematic manner more than saying we are way behind. I don't think that that's the case, that they are way behind, but in some cases they assume that is the reality, even is not. So I would say that this is a great tool for diagnostics in order to start creating the path that they need to follow to get to this common understanding.
Great, thank you. Judith, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. So I think we're gonna learn a lot of projects that will come from Latin America on how they interpret the credits or how they submit the requirements. I believe the sustainability professionals, the culture in Latin America, it's different. So they need in a way to understand like how they fit into all this, and how their project, like Christina mentioned, like they do a lot of these sustainable practices, but they are not aware that's sustainable for the rest of the world, or certain things they do that they do not document, that they have to start, okay, paying attention to this and start a culture of documenting the aspects that they take as for granted in projects.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you to our first panel of experts. I think that was a great way to kick off this last webinar. And so I'd like to turn our attention now. Our next panelist will be addressing Beyond the Bottom Line, Accounting for the Economy of Sustainable Infrastructure. I'm happy to introduce another panel of extremely qualified experts for you. Kicking us off in this second hour, Rod Castro is an expert in building sustainability with advanced know-how in life cycle assessment, life cycle costing, EN and ISO LCA standards, and their application for embodied and operational carbon. He holds a Master's of Science and a PhD in construction management from the University of Florida. Next, we'll hear from John Macumber. John is a member of the finance faculty at Harvard Business School. His research focuses on opportunities for the private and institutional funding and construction of public infrastructure to address issues of migration to cities, existing and worsening resource scarcity, and the increasing impact of climate change on buildings, infrastructure, and cities. His primary finance course at Harvard Business School is entitled Sustainable Cities and Resilient Infrastructure. He is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Healthy Buildings, How Indoor Spaces Drive Performance and Productivity, authored with Dr. Joseph Allen of T.H. Chan Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to joining the Harvard Business School, Mr. Macumber owned and led construction and real estate companies. We'll also be hearing from John Williams, who is the chairman and CEO of Impact Infrastructure, makers of the Autocase software, as well as the board chair of the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure. He has 40 years of experience as an advisor to infrastructure and building development. He started out as a community liaison for major infrastructure projects. In latter years, he served as owner's representative for the development of more than $5 billion in successful public-private ventures. In 2007, he initiated a movement aimed at measuring the value of green infrastructure and buildings, green like sustainability, not like the color. He coined the phrase SROI, Sustainable Return on Investment, and led a team of economists charged with creating an objective, transparent framework for measuring tangible and intangible benefits associated with investments in infrastructure and buildings. In 2012, he founded Impact Infrastructure, the makers of the Autocase software for automated economic analysis. Autocase leveraged cloud-based computing to dramatically reduce the cost and improve the quality of economic assessments on more than $100 billion in projects, including airports, university campuses, hospitals, power infrastructure, commercial buildings, manufacturing, water, wastewater, and stormwater facilities, and mobility investments. So I am tired from listing all of the wonderful accolades. I have shared with you all that we pulled together a expert panel, and I will allow them their full time to share with you what they have planned to present. And once again, we will plan to continue to have Q&A after the hour. So we'll probably plan to wrap up our Q&A around 4:15, 4:20 Eastern time. So we hope you are able to stick around for us. I know you will once we'll let them get started. So Rod, why don't you go ahead and take it away? I will start my share and you are welcome to pick it up.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Let me share my screen with you now. All right, great.
Perfect.
So, So what I want to talk to you about is on how to apply a life cycle perspective for sustainable infrastructure. I work at BioNova, which is a software company. We work globally, and we deliver softwares for life cycle assessment and other life cycle metrics. And we integrate with Autocase or Impact Infrastructure for the delivery of cost-benefit analysis or triple bottom line. We also provide professional services for sustainability policy, EPD verification, LCA, LCC, and other custom tools, and do deep research on decarbonization of the built environment. During my presentation, I go over, to give you a little bit of an introduction of how we see the implementation of a life cycle perspective in the infrastructure sector, how both topic carbon and cost are fundamental, and what tools are available in the market now that can help you deliver those analyses. And finally, to give you some closing remarks or ideas. So to begin, in the US, we know that we are facing an aging infrastructure, but at the same time, globally, there's a rapid globalization and urbanization. And these trends are meeting with climate risk challenges. Nonetheless, we estimate that we'll have an infrastructure growth of more than 6% on a compound annual growth rate from now on until 2026. So there's a big push of more construction in the sector overall. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that for the US right now, to deal with the aging sector, we're talking about $4.5 trillion US dollars just to fix it by 2025, to deal with roads, bridges, dams, and other types of infrastructure. The main challenge remains that all these assets have a long service life, between 50 to 100 years, and during that time, they need to remain functional, durable, and safe. However, climate risk adds an additional ingredient to this in the sense that it's not only the wearability or the use of these assets, but it's actually how the climate will interact with them. So bringing in the ENVISION framework already contains the idea of a life cycle perspective. As you well know, it's a decision-making guide. It's not prescriptive, but it provides the industry a wide sustainability metrics. It recognizes a project's life cycle and it seeks to optimize projects' resilience, both at the short term and long term. So how do you bring this together in a way that you can deliver analysis for your projects? Well, there's several credits available, but I'm going to focus on these three groups right here. In the climate resilience section, which entails reduction of net embodied carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. Also on materials related to support of sustainable procurement practices, and in the economic sense, with the elaboration of a life cycle cost evaluation. Why or how this is important from a life cycle perspective? Well, we have two things going on. One hand, you have the actual building asset, but when you think about it, there are several impacts occurring during its life cycle. When we see from the climate change discussions, normally we talk about carbon as that coin that or currency that everybody translates the impacts to. And when we think of carbon, there are two ways of looking at it. One is the operational side of things, and then it's the actual embodied carbon. The operational has been for a long time the main target of any sustainability policies. And the reason for it is because it's such a high part of the pie, as you can see in the first circle here. However, the decarbonization of the energy grid is reducing the impact of the energy consumption into what buildings or infrastructure impacts could be. And that will lead to an embodied carbon be responsible for about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or about 28% of the global building sector emissions. So when we think about it, to put this in perspective is, we need to break down where the impacts are occurring. So one hand is the manufacturing of the materials, the actual construction process of the infrastructure of building, the use phase, and during that lifetime, you could have also renovations, repairs, or maintenance, standard practice of the O&M of an asset. They will also add into the list of impacts until we finally come to the demolition phase, in which we have to do something with the materials that come out of the the project. So all of these brings into perspective both life cycle carbon and cost, as both materials include the two elements. However, when we think about optimizing an infrastructure project, we need to think about what options do we have and when we can actually make them. You already know this, the typical trade occurs, both of how the opportunities to decrease embodied carbon or carbon in general decrease in time as you fix your decisions related to your project. And how, as the project is defined or the design process moves forward, your cost of change actually increases. So that gives you a high opportunity very early on to make changes. And for that, you need tools that will allow you to account for those impacts before they happen with as little information as possible, but that will enable you to have the highest impacts. So that brings me to the three methodological tools that I want to cover briefly in this presentation. One is life cycle assessment, the other is life cycle costing, and finally cost benefit analysis. From a life cycle assessment perspective, this is basically what I have already covered when I discussed the timeline of our project. Each product that we use or resource has an impact from extraction through the production of that product to its use and finally to what we do with it at the very end. Life cycle assessment is standardized in the way that is calculated. And ISO standards 14040 and 44 gives us that framework. This information is later applied to products. So be a ready-mix concrete, a steel rebar, or any other will actually need to meet certain product standards in the implementation of LCA. So from a product perspective, the output normally of an LCA is an environmental product declaration, which is a document publicly available and that needs to meet ISO standards like 14025 and in the best case 21930. These EPDs are published by program operators like the ones you see here that cover most of the North America market. This brings transparency to the market about what the impact of those materials are. The way that LCA is accounted for is fairly simple in the sense that I'm going to explain to you. The computations require a high degree of modelization and background information. However, we can simply understand them as you need to put together an inventory of materials. It's kind of like the recipe, all the ingredients of your recipe, and what the impacts of those ingredients will be is calculated by multiplying by impact characterization factors. And that provides you as an output estimated environmental impacts, of which one of those is actually global warming potential measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalent. So the formulation is fairly simple, but each material in the background needs to follow a modelization of how the industrial processes are used to the actual creation of the product. And that requires you to have a good database of information. Okay. The next one is life cycle costing or life cycle cost analysis. Part of the standard practice requires you to do a net present value of what a cash flow could be for your project, infrastructure or building. You normally have to do an upfront payment for the asset when you start, and then as you move along, in time, you probably will need to do repairs, and those will incur in additional cash flows that you will discount and bring forward to give you an overall picture of what the actual impact or financial cost of that asset is. So as you can imagine, this highlights the importance of maintenance, but in particular, the material service life. How long does a material actually last before you need to substitute it or repair it? And thirdly is the concept of a cost-benefit analysis. So this is basically looking at trade-offs and trying to understand in a framework everything that you need to know about a particular project. And I give here an example, a green roof. Just try to keep it simple. On one hand, we have that the additional materials that we need to build the green roof will add additional structural load. So we'll have we have to design the structure to meet that load, and then probably an irrigation system or waterproofing and so on. However, as benefits, you will have a reduction in urban heat island effects or internal thermal load or aesthetics. So all of these gives you a chance to put one against the other and try to measure what the cost benefit analysis of making that decision. So if you were to take it in perspective, here, for instance, is a good way to look at it. So this impact horizon basically looks at a 60-year period for an asset, let's say a building. From an LCA perspective, most of the impacts in materials occur at the beginning. However, each of these bumps represents maintenance or replacements impacts that happen along the way, including end-of-life scenarios. When you look at it in another way, you basically see that the or the initial impacts of the materials normally take about at least 60% or more of your overall footprint. However, this gives you a very different picture when you go into detail to what each material can do for your project. So in one case, in this case, for instance, metals carries the biggest load, or maybe glass. So these are the things that you need to take care of if you want to reduce that footprint. So you also need that level of granularity to understand how to have an impact on those materials to reduce your impacts. If we see it on another perspective from a life cycle cost side of things, each of these material impacts are basically costs that you're adding up during your life cycle of your asset. So these are the ones that you need to bring forward. So it's not that your project only costs you what you put at the down payment, let's say, or at the initial stage, but actually what it incurs along the whole horizon. So this, from a materials point of view, brings in opportunities on procurement for infrastructure. Not all materials are made the same, and that is something that you need to look into your market. In this graph, for instance, I'm showing here, it's a ready-mix concrete for structures that has a very wide range of available products. It basically is looking at 21 products ready-mix with this particular performance. And as you can see, we could be ranging from less than 200 kilos of CO2 up to almost 500 kilos. So quite a broad range. Of course, in your market, you will need to find out where you could actually be into that range, and then try to see how you can actually push that market with new benchmarks or goals during the procurement process that could help general contractors or others to bid or tender for information that will include not only cost, but also the carbon component into this. Finally, when we think about sustainability, we've looked at both the environmental impacts and the financials, life cycle assessment, life cycle costing. So it's being a story of carbon and cost together. However, they also, when we think about the benefits and costs, they talk about to us about the externalities, the social impacts that are not part of the regulation. And for that, you need to actually account for things like a social cost of carbon. And this, the idea with what I want to close my presentation is when you take a life cycle perspective, you need to have an integrated vision. It's not only focused on one element like carbon, cost, you also need to bring in other benefits or impacts. And the way to address those are through a social cost of carbon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rod. That was an incredibly informative presentation. I know our viewers are really appreciative of all of that really hands-on, tangible information that you're able to share, and they'll be able to take that forward into their workdays. And likewise, John McLemore, I'm happy to welcome you to the floor. I know you have some exciting and timely information to share with us. So please welcome. You are welcome to start sharing your screen and get started with your presentation materials.
Great, thanks, Lindsay, and thanks everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you today. It's timely anyway. I'm not sure how, well, it's timely. We'll talk about that. So what I wanted to do today was, let's see, Lindsay, can you see a virtual workshop about Beyond the Bottom Line? Okay, on this screen. So it says virtual workshop session F. Do you see that?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, so the title of our presentation, or our segment, is around the virtual workshop and Beyond the Bottom Line, which means to me, what's the social cost of what's going on. And John Williams and I were talking about the prevention and the cost of recovery now in the time of viruses, because with the coronavirus and future ones, the world is not going to be the same. And we don't think it's necessarily realistic to talk about things like they used to be. So here's some accounting concepts together with the theme of this block that we might be able to think about. And I'm really putting this forth as a thought piece more than anything else. I'm going to read from the slide a little bit. I almost never do that, but it seems to me that for a long time, the life cycle of benefit cost analysis has been mostly CO2, water, and energy. Actually, Rod did a nice example of that. But with the origin and the spread of the COVID virus, this shows the value of physical investments preventing the spread, notably around the things that we work on all the time, like water systems, like urban planning for ventilation and air and sunlight in streets, like mass transit, like those kind of things. Even aspects like how do you have markets operate more effectively, whether it's markets where they sell wild animals or markets where my grandmother goes and stockpiles toilet paper when she's looking for things to think about this, about stocking up. So I thought I would try to do a thought piece around public spending in response to and recovery from the virus. How can we have done this better? How can we think about prevention and tracking the accounting for the value obtained in prevention, but bringing that earlier on to the investment phase of projects? So I believe there's been several phases in what we talk about at the SoftNest program, what we talk about in our industry around thinking about public health and thinking about life cycle and thinking about accounting for the things we look at. So we started out on this quest thinking about life cycle costs and energy savings. Our attention moved to the cost of society of greenhouse gases and carbon, a lot of which is the sustainability agenda. More recently, we've been thinking about resilience infrastructure. This has come to top of mind because we're thinking about infrastructure that can defend or rebound from shocks like flooding or wildfire or sea rise or drought. How do we think about investing in infrastructure, or which infrastructure investments to make in that regard? And to me now, we need to think about cities and about infrastructure assets and buildings, all of which can defend from biological shocks like COVID-19 and the next pandemic after that. So this is a real evolution in our thinking about how do we count this stuff and how do we account for it. This also is a change in the kind of toolkit that we need. So these various phases are characterized by different components and different uncertainties. So life cycle cost analyses tend to have a low upfront cost to implement. Whatever the thing is you're doing that's going to save you some energy doesn't cost that much. They have a moderate cost benefit to realize. You get a little bit of return on energy. A high probability of being accurate. The diagrams that Rod showed you are probably pretty close to right. And a direct link from who invests to who benefits. If I spend money to save energy in my building, I probably benefit. Greenhouse gas mitigation has a moderate upfront cost to implement. The benefit is very dispersed and it's realized eventually. Has a high probability of being accurate, but little link from who invests to who directly benefits. So this is the concept that John Williams will probably talk about in terms of the social return on infrastructure and that aspect of triple bottom line. And one of the challenges for our industry has been to think, how do we take these very diffuse benefits that accrue to everybody and somehow funnel them back into these very specific infrastructure investments that one entity makes? So if you extend the thinking about what our attention has been drawn to, investing in resilient infrastructure in the face of perils like sea rise or flooding, wildfire, and drought can have a very high cost to realize. Sometimes the cost is clear in preparation, but there's a low probability of occurrence. This is really different than thinking about carbon savings or energy savings. So you don't know the thing is going to happen. So you have to look at probabilities. Probabilities matter. And now in the time of viruses, where the damage is even worse than a flood or a wildfire, we need to be thinking about urban systems and what we all do, infrastructure assets and buildings that help us to resist or live with COVID-19, which looks like it'll be here for a while, and there will be another one, most likely. So the interventions have a low cost to realize. A lot of things around a healthy building or a healthy city don't cost much to start with. We can have confidence in their efficacy that, yes, if we have more ventilation or more sunlight, we'll have less spread of disease, and there are both social and whole system benefits. The probability of shock events like a new coronavirus is low, but the potential costs are astronomical. So to me, the accounting that we do for investments in sustainability and resilience have to keep that in mind. So now let's consider how to account for some of these additional upfront investments in infrastructure now that benefit ourselves and society later. So this is preamble to what I'm going to do as a finance professor, which is show you numbers. And I'll show a spreadsheet with a short expected value analysis of making an investment in resilience or not, with a couple different sets of inputs. And one input the first time around assumes that we don't really think of the cost to society at all or the benefits. And it's a relatively low impact event. Then we'll show a second one that's higher impact, higher cost. And I'll be curious what people think about that. So here's an example as a thought experiment. Remember, none of these numbers are right, but they're directional. For how do we account for and share the cost of investing in resilience in consideration of the new cost exposures that are here? So the way this spreadsheet is set up, and this is embarrassingly simple compared to what both of the people on both sides of me can talk about. Probability of this bad event, that might be a flood or a fire, is 2.5% in 1 year. Without doing any preparation, your direct cost to recover is, say, $1 million or 1,000 in this, say, we'll call them millions. Without any preparation, the indirect cost to recover to you as a proponent is zero because it's somebody else's problem. And the cost to prepare was pretty light. It's only $10 million. But with preparation, the direct cost to recover is 100. So there's these various proportions of how things might play out in terms of if you're not prepared, it costs more to recover than if you spent a little bit more money on that. And this is the classic way we think about seatbelts or vaccinations or lots of other things like that. So the decision is, do we invest extra in our project incrementally to do something? And these investments have gotten more and more complex as we move up from energy savings to greenhouse gas reduction to weather resilience and now virus resilience. So these mirror the 4 steps that I talked about earlier in our studies of infrastructure. So the key decision, of course, is no, I'm not going to invest, or yes, I am going to invest. And then later on, we see if the event actually happens. So in this situation, we're saying in the no route, the incremental cost to prepare is nothing because you're not preparing. And probably this event won't happen, at least not this year. So therefore, the recovery cost is going to be very low. And that's likely what's going to happen. However, there is a chance that the event does happen. In this situation, a 2.5% chance. In that case, you have to pay the $1,000 to recover to put your thing back together. But since there's only a 25% chance that that happens, the math is relatively straightforward. That'd be 25 if it happens. So what you do is add the whole thing up to get the expected value of that path. The lower path, yes, I made the decision to protect, means you spend $10 in preparation. The event probably won't happen. So now you spent $10 you didn't have to spend, and you got no benefit from that. The expected value is 23. It's pretty close to what the value to prepare would have been. And this is actually true in a lot of the real world. So you don't spend the extra money to prepare because the bad event probably isn't going to happen. So we don't really care. If you extend this out further, the proponent, in this case, bears all of this. We've assumed that the proponent is not being repaid by society at all, or even thinking about the social cost of society. It's kind of like if you are thinking about fire protecting your building. It's not going to hurt society if your building burns down, probably. So the proponent bears the whole cost. So of course, this can get much more elaborate. It can have Monte Carlo simulation, you get multiple stages and all that. But I wanted to put this general idea out there in the old world. So let me propose as a thought experiment the new world. So in the new world that we're in this morning, there might be a much lower probability of an event. It might only be a 1% chance, but it might cost more to recover, but there might be huge indirect costs like everybody's sick, everybody is out of work. It doesn't mean just fixing the flood in your basement. It means what about all the things that happen? It could mean the incremental cost to repair was quite low. In this case, the same 10, meaning, yes, we made sure that we had all the water filtration in our building tested so that it wouldn't get Legionnaire's disease. We made sure to have high ventilation. We made sure to screen people's temperatures as they walked in the door, and the direct cost to recover is low. There's still a cost to society of this imaginary contagion, but quite a bit less. So these numbers, of course, are exaggerated. There's a 10x difference in the without prep and the with prep. But you can see in some circumstances, like as you look at the spread of the virus in Singapore or South Korea, that with some preparation, the cost can be kept down quite a bit. So this makes the decision look a little bit different.
Hey, John, we're not seeing, oh, there we go. Never mind, you got it.
Okay, sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. So the direct costs of society are quite a bit higher in this model. So what happens is you think about extending this math is you're looking now at these massive issues, these things that are really a big deal. If it might be a 10,000 or 10 million or $10 billion kind of downside, that's a lot different than thinking, okay, it's just a smaller issue. But you still have the situation where the proponent themselves only bears a small, relatively small amount of it. But a lot is then borne by society. And this is one of the questions that we all have to deal with going forward, is how are we going to take this cost borne by society and figure out a way to persuade these proponents to spend more money, making their hotel more, making their hotel safer, making their public transit system better ventilated, thinking of ways to keep people farther apart when they're in the market, those kind of issues. You can see here that the expected value for both for all of society together and the people is substantially better. Here's a 3x kind of difference, which if you're talking about millions or billions, is a huge difference in how people live. So the accounting possibility for me is this is a substantial improvement in expected value cost. If these kind of numbers can be borne out, this is financial by third parties. So Judith and Christina talked before about we should be able to find the financing. Well, that's my job, is to find the financing. And what I look at a lot is how can you show a demonstrable improvement in the expected value of an outcome like this, and in a way that a third party can finance. And I believe part of it is by having society saying, you know, this costs us so much, we're going to pony up and help you, proponent, to make investments in resilience, particularly around diseases going forward. So let me stop here. I don't think I've used the whole 15 minutes, and people are either totally scratching their heads and baffled, or they might want me to go through this. And for your viewing pleasure, I have the live spreadsheet if you want to look at that also, but we can do that during the question and answer.
I'm so glad you came before me, John. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Williams, and I'm speaking with you from my home in White Plains, New York. We're 6 miles from the US epicenter of the coronavirus. I'm happy to report that my wife and I are fine. We're following the rules, but, and most importantly, we're more determined than ever to make a difference for this world and to leave it a better place for future generations. And I'm happy to be amongst so many like-minded people. So let me turn off my camera. I spend lots of time within the investment and project finance world. Over the next 15 minutes, 14 minutes, we'll focus on a couple of key questions. Where will future project finance capital come from? And green is good, but what's it worth and who cares? Setting aside the current pandemic, which has wiped out massive amounts of wealth, there remain enormous pools of committed capital available for infrastructure, for investment in sustainable buildings and infrastructure. As I mentioned in my webinar 1 opening remarks, we can expect that additional funds will come in the form of stimulus measures that will flow into infrastructure and buildings. And by the way, John, those public dollars have the right to demand external benefits in return for them. So I'll come back to that. Having lived through at least 5 recessions plus 9/11, I've noticed that the full impact of major slowdowns tend to hit our industry hardest about 18 months after the core event or after stimulus funds are consumed. In the meantime, our backlog of building and infrastructure needs is ever expanding, stretching available resources to the point that returns on investment across the triple bottom line will matter more and more. Yesterday morning, I mentioned the likelihood of intense scrutiny linked to the new version of stimulus, whereby funds are expected to yield triple bottom line returns in the form of public health benefits, reductions in carbon emissions, hardening against extreme weather events, social justice enhancements, greater rewards from opportunity zones, and overarching sustainability and resilience goals. In other words, that capital will seek projects that deliver optimal financial, social, environmental, and economic returns. In the meantime, institutional investors have committed capital right now that needs to flow into credible projects. Environmental, social, and governance investors, they're called ESG investors, are demanding far more in terms of data to back up claims of impact, sustainability, resilience, and stakeholder returns. While their $23 trillion may have shrunk to a smaller number, say $18 trillion, that amount is twice what the world spent on buildings and infrastructure last year. Now, of course, ESG investments are in addition to tax and user fee-based funding common in the United States. As large-scale efforts like LaGuardia Airport's reconstruction, the Cuomo Bridge across the Hudson River, and the LA Civic Center projects demonstrate effective use of private partnerships and finance, you can expect policymakers and private financiers to demand more and more in terms of sustainability, resilience, and reductions in carbon emissions. Stakeholders, including public company shareholders, will also focus on material risks that go with ignoring the performance of investments that they have underwritten in poor performance in the form of inefficient buildings and commitments to infrastructure that has negative effects on society and the environment. These are material risks that can now be measured and valued as they accrue over time. So keep your eyes peeled for some class action lawsuits. They're headed our way. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, institutions, and wealthy families want nothing to do with those risks. Publicly traded companies are likely to share a similar concern. Imagine a big company like Amazon spending billions of dollars each year on lease payments or rent payments in buildings that are low performing buildings. I'm not saying they're doing that, I'm offering it as an example. But if you were spending $3 billion a year on poor performing buildings, what does that do in terms of material risk? That you're enabling poor performance that could have an impact on the environment, on public health, on water, on climate change, all sorts of things. Those impacts can now be measured and in value assigned to specific stakeholder groups. Sustainable and responsible investing has taken center stage amongst the giants of finance. Even $9 trillion equals the total global investments in building and infrastructure last year. They're all in search of evidence as to material risks and benefits that will accrue to their customers. Capital will flow to projects that deliver positive triple bottom line returns. We can go to the next slide. Each of these 63 funds is hungry for projects to underwrite and to own. They're sitting on committed capital that must be deployed in order to make money. The ability to value internal and external project or asset performance will be key to inclusion in those funds. More and more projects need to come equipped to navigate fund due diligence with transparent business cases. Many of you are familiar with green bonds, another growing category eager to source investments in projects like energy, water, waste management, and efficient buildings. The green bond principles have long called for the use of a common standard and metrics to provide evidence of green results. An ENVISION rating provides transparency in process, and triple bottom line based cost benefit analysis provides economic assessments that tap global, these TBL-CBA economic assessments tap the global default standard for project assessment, which is known as benefit cost analysis, to determine the value of internal and externalities, including implications for communities and, as John said a moment ago, society. I should point out that in the past, passion or talk of green was often passed off as evidence in lieu of rigorous due diligence. That situation is changing rapidly as investors discover the $100 billion plus in sustainable projects that are backed by data from automated assessments enabled by cloud-based computing. Now, looking ahead, we can expect pressure to grow from disappointments associated with past stimulus programs that delivered old-fashioned products or projects that were planned in the 80s and 90s that weren't really focused on climate change or pandemics or sustainability or resilience. In addition to their shortcomings in meeting global sustainability and carbon reduction goals, as well as shortfalls of domestic development programs aimed at underprivileged neighborhoods and communities that feature promises without specifics of benefits exchanged for huge tax breaks flowing to developers and luxury projects. Opportunity zones will soon be raising expectations for objective evidence of public co-benefits or good. Those benefits that can be measured over the life of an investment. This is all part of impact investors morphing into stakeholder investors in search of TBL-CBA-based business cases that show returns to asset owners, occupants and users, as well as host communities and society. The ESG movement has grown so large that non-ESG funds, more traditional funds, are also assumed to do no harm. We've grown accustomed to expecting financial returns in conjunction with social good return, that's double bottom line returns. And most recently, interests are growing in triple bottom line returns. Again, the realization that more than $100 billion in building and infrastructure projects across the public and the private sector have been assessed for positive and negative value from energy, water, air quality, carbon, vehicle miles traveled, waste management, worker productivity, community health, recreation, and even learning outcomes make our projects, the projects that everyone on this call do, obvious targets for investments. Further, the ability to assess, value, report, monitor, and track performance over an investment life will change the way these projects are viewed, shifting attention to the value of good that investors enable while enhancing the credibility of the statement, green is good. Now, we, the folks shown on this slide, can say what the benefits are and what they're worth and to whom. As project advocates make their case, they'll learn to swap value between project stakeholders as a form of political currency, matching value and benefits to the stakeholders that can most benefit from each element of the pie. So the owners and users and host community. So where will they get this information from? They're going to get it from you, the people on this call, the planning and design professionals on the front line. They're already relying on you for feasibility studies, siting, environmental assessments and permitting, design, construction, commissioning, operations, and decommissioning. It's time that you paid attention to the business cases that you're front loading with decisions made on behalf of asset owners and ultimately the sources of capital. Yesterday, during webinar 1, I focused specifically on the likelihood of stimulus funds with strings attached. Expectations of TBL value in return for access to public funding. I issued a call to arms, or it may make you feel more comfortable to say a call to action for members of the AEC community to get ready to do your part in converting emergency spending into projects that deliver real 21st century results that address public health, carbon reduction, sustainability, and resilience goals. Your professional weapons in the war to recover from the pandemic and the likely recessions are tools and training available today and offered through this webinar. The good news is that ENVISION 3.0 LD 3.3 will guide you from basic LCCA to more sophisticated triple bottom line cost benefit analysis. ISI has training programs already available for you and an outstanding online or video training. It will help you determine the value of risks and benefits. It will help you address uncertainties, and it will guide you ultimately to transparent business cases. You can earn up to 14 months while helping your customers answer those what's in it for me, what's it worth, and to whom questions that haunt each of our projects. The results of the assessments will fit nicely into financial due diligence requirements while setting the stage for performance monitoring. And by the way, you can do that for the projects too. So allow me to just share a couple of quick examples with you. The first is from a U.S. Army hospital in Fort Bliss in Texas. It involves a military hospital design programming driven by triple bottom line cost benefit analysis, testing of technology options for a set of for an entire complex of more than 1 million square feet valued at about $1.2 billion in costs. Each option was assessed for impact and net present value of triple bottom line and financial returns. One element that's especially relevant today was the weighing of costs and benefits associated with maximum energy efficiency versus measures for infection control. I'm going to just pause here and go off script slightly. This was so interesting because at the time when we did this work, the Army wanted to get every bit of energy efficiency they possibly could out of technology. And in fact, the economic assessment got them to like a 92, 93% point in terms of their goals. But they said, what about a couple more points? What about something else? And we said, well, wait a second. Let's take a look at what those extra few percentage points will deliver in terms of benefit versus their costs. And let's compare them with something else, say infection control. What technology can help you with infection control? And there was a massive difference thanks to HEPA filtration and the use of hydrogen peroxide vapor cleaning. It was massive. Nothing gives like an infection when it comes to costs. You can bet that future building projects, whether they're hospitals or commercial buildings or schools, will think about infection control. Let's go to the next slide, Lindsay. You can see here the costs. The far right corner are the costs, and the second column in is the value of benefits associated with these technological options. And so the Army sped to these alternatives and said, that's good enough. So let's go to the next slide. San Francisco Airport was one of the early organizations to really embrace triple bottom line cost benefit analysis. What I'm showing you here is from SFO Terminal 1. This was a P3 project, and we were involved there with Gensler, Arup, HKS, and of course, San Francisco Airport operations. They require triple bottom line based cost benefit analysis in each of their P3 contracts now. And we looked at a range of building design features or options for their total costs versus the value of triple bottom line benefits. Some of these options, as a result, were ruled out, others were ruled in, and others were even prioritized sooner than later because they were found to provide the greatest good. Let's go to the next slide. In San Antonio, we work with San Antonio River Authority, Urban Eco Plan, and CDM Smith to look at a series of projects involved with green infrastructure and preservation planning. And each of these projects were evaluated, their design features, based on the value of public benefit and overall triple bottom line results. That was one of many engagements we've had with them. The practical benefits of these economic assessments have been so powerful there. Let's go to the next slide. In LA County, the LA County Green Infrastructure Project involved comparisons, once again, based on total returns, the total costs of building, construction, operations, and replacement versus the total value of social, environmental, and economic benefits to the county, to the other communities that make up the county, to the residents of the county, to the people who use these facilities. And it was a smashing success. By the way, there was an earlier project that involved, this project on the screen involves Stantec. The earlier project involves CH2, which is now part of Jacobs, I believe. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to conclude by asking you a question, and it sounds like a dumb question, but it seems to me it's not asked often enough, and that is, why do we create infrastructure projects? Why do we do this? Why do we go through the expense and pain and time and processes? Why do we do that? Because there's some public need that needs to be filled, okay? And there's some valuable public benefit, social, environmental, economic benefit. There are also private sector benefits that come from these projects. That's why we're doing these things. So why on earth are we not talking about the value of benefit? I just want you to think about that, okay? So finally, it's important to know that it's not about buying points, and I mean that respectfully to a previous speaker. I'm glad that you brought this up. It's about underwriting the production of environmental, social, and economic benefits. That's why we spend money. Those benefits can be measured, they can be valued, they can be presented in transparent, fully documented business cases that investors are demanding. More and more of your role as a design professional will be tied to being able to determine and articulate the value of your solutions and that they will deliver. So again, think of this information as a form of currency to be traded between stakeholders to help a project move forward and to deliver the results that were promised. I want to offer one last example that is so timely. This is involves the City of Los Angeles's new Civic Center development, which is a multi-billion-dollar P3-based development program aimed at delivering a very green product for a mayor that's committed big time to the new Green Deal. That same product now is likely to take its position amongst major efforts aimed at recovery from the pandemic and the recession. Now, the procurement and project design teams will be called on to step up and show the way. And their efforts, focused on sustainability ratings backed by triple bottom line cost benefit based business cases, will help the mayor explain what the green is worth and to whom. So that's what his development team will deliver. Are you in a position to help? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, John. And I think our viewers really appreciate this call to action. I can tell, and I'm very happy and pleased with this concluding panel of experts for our overall virtual workshop. I can tell from the questions that folks are ready to go. They want to know what's next. They want to know how they can learn more. So with that, I think we do have stay on the line for an extra 10 minutes or so to address some of these questions. And if you all would bear with me for just one moment while I get things lined up here. So again, if we can continue with our questions, and I think you'll see the theme of our viewers want to know more. They want to know what's next. We've got some kind of not in the weeds, but some technical questions for each of our panelists on how similar things can be replicated. So my first question is for Rod, if you would be able to share with us how Bionova, your company, constructs life cycle assessments for the same project. So we have a question from a viewer wanting to know how many times does your company make several different LCAs for the same project? Meaning, do you have a baseline for a standard project versus one that's more for a green and sustainable project? So can you walk us through your process for life cycle assessments for a project?
Yes. Hi, Lindsay. Thank you for that question. So in general, what we do is we provide a software called One-Click LCA to allow any design team to actually produce their own analysis. And what we do is we offer a extensive construction material database that allows you to understand the material choices you have in your market, and those are associated with their actual carbon footprint and other environmental impact indicators. The way to do this, it can be applied from the concept stage all the way through design development and construction documentation and onwards. The tool builds upon the standard, which breaks the analysis in each life cycle stage and allows you to import data either manually or with other softwares like BIM or the design tools. So there's different ways to actually bring a material quantity, which is the main input, and then map that to our database and come up with the results in the background. So you don't have to be an expert in life cycle assessment to be able to work with us. Basically, you're able to create that baseline for your own project, and that will depend on project type or the material choices that you decide to do. And you can do as many iterations within the same workspace as you like.
Great, thank you so much for that. Very much appreciated. Continuing on this theme of what's next, I've got a question for John Macumber, and John Williams, you might be able to weigh in for us a little bit as well. We've got a comment from one of our viewers that indicates that our next steps might be able to look for where the money is coming from. And John Macumber, you indicated kind of this dual scenario of low probability of an event occurring and what it's going to cost both directly and indirectly to recovering versus an even lower probability event as we're seeing now, and kind of the direct and indirect costs and extrapolating those costs. and where can you talk a little bit about where the money might be able to come from that that we can use to help us recover from the events that we're using, or the events that we're experiencing now?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's obviously very early days and we're waiting for the Senate to stop arguing, but there's going to have to be money that comes from the private sector, because as John Williams said, there are tens of trillions of dollars. Am I still muted?
No, you're on.
Okay, there are tens of trillions of dollars of capital in institutional investors, in endowments, pension funds, insurance companies, and high net worth individuals looking to get invested. And yes, there are maybe 10% less than there was 2 weeks ago, but it still exists. So that's the biggest pool. And when you see investments that have the kind of yield that I indicated, even probability adjusted, then you can attract people to those. So the question in the resilience space, just looking at floods or wildfires, was which of the investments that make sense in resilience and beefing up and hardening assets are the ones that people would invest in today. Now in the pandemic world, post-pandemic world, you see that the downside, the cost of the black swan events is being much higher. And then the question becomes, do you try and insure that if you're a business or a school or a city or an infrastructure operator against this massive loss? Or if it's relatively straightforward to invest in, as most of these public health things are, why wouldn't you just go ahead and borrow the money yourself to do that? So I actually see that being the larger aspect of investing. There's a second piece around this, which has to do with what John Williams also talked about, which is the multiple upcoming stimulus packages. And that has to do with project selection. And all of us on this call get involved in project selection all the time. And I would advocate, naturally, as a finance guy from Harvard, evaluate the projects that have the best benefit cost analysis and that, in the words of Buckminster Fuller, do the most good for the most people at the least cost. That is not how project investment works in American politics, but I hope that the magnitude of this disaster is so large that we're able to go through and think, look, let's rationally think how we're going to invest based on where the money is well spent and not necessarily on where the electoral votes are.
Thank you. And John Williams, would you do you have anything to add to that comment from your perspective?
Well, I think John gave a much better answer than I will, but we have to realize there are lots of eyes on what's happening right now behind these discussions relative to a stimulus package. And I agree that institutional investors have massive amounts of money. Boy, a $300 or $400 or $500 billion jumpstart in public funds that demand resilience and public health and sustainability outcomes as the strings attach can make a huge difference in jumpstarting all this. And we are in an election cycle. It doesn't matter who you want to vote for. There are going to be eyes peeled on what are these dollars actually going to flow to, and will they actually help people? And will they help prevent this kind of an event in the future? And I hope with all my heart that we don't stop asking that question. And I hope that our industry steps up and says, why aren't you considering these types of outcomes? That's your job. That's why we use tax dollars for infrastructure and building projects. So I'm challenging everybody on this call to raise your voices and work through your organizations to set the expectations higher for what we can get out of these project investments.
I think that's great. And I think that's great to underscore your call to action for everyone on this call. I have a broader question that I'd like to use to wrap this Q&A session. And I'm going to allow each of our speakers an opportunity to respond to this question in addition to our speakers from the initial session, because I think you all have some interesting perspectives that you can use to bring to the table in response to this question. And so I'd like to know from you, and you can kind of pick and choose, what are either the risks that the current crisis is presenting for sustainable infrastructure, and what are the opportunities that you see? So Rod, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll move to response from John Macomber before I pivot to our first session speakers. And John Williams, if you don't mind, we'll use your response to this question to close out our Q&A session. So
Great, thank you.
Rod, what are the risks and what are the opportunities you're seeing this current crisis presents sustainable infrastructure?
Yes. So the current crisis, I think that will have the greatest impacts is in the construction industry and across the whole supply chain from a material side perspective. This would probably slow down several projects, but I think it will give the opportunity to stop and think how we can actually redesign or rethink our supply chain and how we want to move forward in the construction, design and construction of projects overall. I cannot, emphasize enough that at the end, this is an integrated process. So on one hand is materials and carbon footprinting and other environmental impacts, but then there's the cost or the financial side of it and the actual social impacts that are in the background that need to be accounted for.
Thank you. John Macomber, what would you like to add? What are the risks and opportunities you're seeing?
Well, I think it's a short-termism versus long-termism trade-off. So I'll use the metaphor of thinking about the $400 million forever bond that Miami, Florida issued. And as they argue about what projects to think about, the question comes up of, do we go and pump out some little old lady's basement tomorrow? Or do we think about investing in raising all the train tracks for 20 years from now? You could argue that the train track investment will be a better long-term investment, but there's also a lot of short-term interest in doing particular things. So it's not clear how this crisis will play out around whether the very short-term band-aids get put together or whether there's an opportunity to step back and think, well, the cards have been reshuffled. Let's think about how we're going to spend money on infrastructure going forward. So that's both the risk and the opportunity.
Fantastic, thank you. Julie, will you be able to give us some insights from what's happening on the ground at the City of Westminster? What's the perspective? What are some of the risks that you're seeing, and as well as what are some of the opportunities? Julie, you're on mute.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi there.
I'm sorry, I'm multitasking. I'm on another phone call.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I'll circle back to you. We're talking about the risks and the opportunities presented through the current
I'll call you later.
situation. So I'm looking for the perspective from the City of Westminster. So I'll circle back. We're wrapping up our panel session with kind of getting everybody's perspective on this one question. So we'll circle back to you. Judith, do you have some perspective on the answer to this question from what you've seen?
Well, I think this has to become mainstream, like John Williams was saying at the end. And there is a lot of interest for people to acquire skills in doing LCAs and integrating this into the process of project development. I have a question for the panel. What do you guys think is the biggest barrier for this to go forward?
That's a good question. John Williams, in your closing remarks, I'm going to put that one to you. Be aware. So Julie, if we're able to circle back to you, we were looking for the perspective from City of Westminster. What are the risks that you're seeing the current situation is presenting to sustainable infrastructure, and kind of the opposite of that, to mirror that, what are some of the opportunities that you're seeing for increasing sustainable infrastructure?
I'm thinking primarily of the water plant. It's going to be the biggest investment the city has made, the biggest single investment the city has made in, well, years, probably close to 20 years. And so the risk to not thinking through sustainability and longer term is the risk of doing it the same way we've done it before, which has, how are you going to deconstruct? How are you going to build the next phase? How are you going to keep it running safely while you're under construction again? And with the ENVISION framework, there are, I can't remember the credits, but they do guide you in thinking about those items. And the risk to not thinking through it and taking action on them is finding yourself, 25 years down the road with your first series of pumps that need rehabilitating and replacement, and you can't dispose of them, you can't recycle them, you can't rebuild them, you can't even get them out of your facility because you didn't think about that. The opportunities on the positive side are, and I think we're doing that with our design working group. We're bringing the community in to talk about how they can impact and how they can influence. And it's mucking around the edges. I get that. It's trees and architecture. But along the way, we're going to get to talk with them about why water treatment is so important and the choices the city is making to include treatment for catastrophic water conditions that we can sort of suspect what they might look like, although we don't exactly know. But they might be reassured that we really are thinking ahead and we are thinking about, not them, they're in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, but we're thinking about their grandkids and we're thinking about those future generations that will benefit from what we've thought through today. And that is an opportunity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. And John Williams, will you help us close this Q&A session with some more, with your perspective on a response to this question, also considering Judith's additional question of what are the barriers that we'll need to overcome in the near future, and leave us with some of your words of wisdom and inspiration for what our next steps might be.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody participating.
Βολτίτσα από τα πόδια, είναι πολύ καλός ο καιρός.
Νίκο μου, τώρα είναι καλά. The speakers who preceded me, I think we, a collective we, can make the difference between that short-term Band-Aid that we're so accustomed to, that now we know has left us vulnerable to future, in quotations, infections, calamities of all types. And now we know we need long-term solutions that address our societal vulnerability. And the barrier, the former barrier was always stakeholder reluctance. Do we spend money here, or should we do this, or what's green, or, do we really need this? Well, now, with this pandemic and the associated economic collapse, it's clear to every person in this country, and will be clear to every person on this planet, that we need to do things differently. And we need to be paying attention to the long term rather than the short term. And all those people can look to our community, the architects, engineers, the planners, the sustainability professionals, to lead the way using tools like ENVISION to help take follow a methodical path toward better decision-making, longer-term outcomes, and ultimately producing the public benefits that we all are entitled to, and we all need to invest in order to have a future as humanity. So I want to thank everybody for their involvement in the virtual workshop. I want to thank especially Lindsay and Spiro and Anthony Kane and all the speakers and all of you who've called in and stayed with us through these 4 sessions. To me, it's really encouraging. As I said, I live close to the epicenter of this pandemic, and the thing that gets me through the day is knowing there are solutions. There's solutions, and we can use them, and we can do great things with them. So, Lindsay, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think that's a positive, forward-thinking way to wrap our Q&A session and to overall wrap this virtual workshop. So I do thank you for that. And thank you for our speakers from both panels, all 7 of our expert speakers, for your insights and your perspectives on how to address the challenges ahead. We applaud you for your efforts and really appreciate your presentations today. This concludes today's presentation, and it wraps 2 days of virtual workshop. We thank you all for all who have been able to join us over the past couple of days. I've had fun myself. I think this has been great. We'll look forward to having you on future webinars and future presentations. Until next time, thank you all for being such great leaders in the infrastructure industry as we work together to build a more sustainable future.